Hello crafty friends, welcome to today's smooshing video. Today we're going to look at different mediums that you can use to smoosh with. Last week we looked at different tools, so if you'd like to watch that video there will be a link in this video's description for you. The tool I'm going to use today for everything is a smoosher. If you want to know how to make a smoosher, there's a video linked for that as well. So to get going, I've got some Distress Oxide here in Wild Honey. I'm going to put that on my mat, turn it into a paint with a bit of water, pick it up with my smoosher, and I'm going to smoosh it on. And you can keep going like this until you've got the kind of coverage that you're looking for. I think that will do for me for now. But on half of this, I'm going to smoosh some worn lipstick. And I'm going to do it before the yellow, the wild honey, is dry. And what happens is you get a nice blending of colours. And now I'm going to dry that with my hairdryer. So what we've got there is a wet in wet technique. You're putting wet paint on wet paint or wet ink on wet ink. But now I'm going to do the top half and I'm going to do wet on dry. I'm going to take wet ink and put it on top of dry ink. And dry that with my hairdryer. So there we have a wet on dry, and this one's a wet on wet. And with this one you blend the colours and get a very soft look. With this one you can maintain the two different colours, one on top of the other. We're going to stick with Distress Oxides for a minute. Instead of turning the ink into paint with plain old water, I'm going to turn it into paint with this white shimmer spray. So I'm going to add that to the Wild Honey and pick that up and smoosh that on. And I'll dry that. With the worn lipstick, I'm going to add a bit of this Copper Blaze shimmer spray. Just a little bit, and that will make the worn lipstick shimmery as well. I could have used the white one and that would have maintained the worn lipstick colour. Adding the Copper Blaze has changed the colour a little bit, and I'll dry that. So hopefully you can see in there some lovely shimmer and shine. As well as adding shimmer sprays to inks, you can smoosh with sprays themselves. They don't have to be shimmery. They could just be plain old painty sprays. You can just spray onto a palette or a glass mat and smoosh with sprays directly. Again, I'm going to stick with Distress Oxides and I'm going to hydrate them with water. And I'm going to dry this a bit, but not completely. I want some little patches of liquid still for this next technique. And now, while this is still partially wet, I'm going to drizzle over some embossing powder. This is gold embossing powder. What I'm also going to do is take a paintbrush and spatter on a few bits of water too and drizzle the gold over that. And I'm going to heat this with my heat tool, but I'm going to heat it from underneath so that it doesn't blow the embossing powder away. And there you go, some lovely heat embossing that is sitting where the ink pooled. So it looks like it's part of the design. And you can do this with inks other than Distress Oxide as well. So if you've got other hybrid inks or dye inks, then you can still do this embossing technique. Speaking of other inks, I've got some Catherine Pooler dye inks. So I've got Tiara, which is an orange yellow from the Party collection, and Coral Cabana, which is a red orange from the Party collection. I'll start with the yellow. Same technique, just add water or shimmer spray, pick it up with your smoosher or whatever tool you're smooshing with and smoosh it on. Before it dries completely, I'm going to add a layer of Coral Cabana. Dry that. Now I've got some Coral Cabana going over the dry tiara. So that was wet on dry and that was wet on wet. And similarly to the Distress Oxides, you get a blending when you do wet on wet and you get a layering when you do wet on dry. But because there's no pigment in the dye inks, you'll find you get more of a blend of colour rather than a true colour laying on top of the colour underneath. As I said, you could do this technique as well with your dye inks, and you can mix your dye inks with shimmer sprays too. As well as using ink pads to smoosh with, you can use ink from reinkers. These are the things you use to re-ink your ink pads. I've got the Catherine Pooler ones, Distress Oxide ones, and a few Distress Ink ones. I always give all of them a good shake, just to make sure everything is combined properly before doing anything with them. So all you need to do is put a drop or two on your palette, your glass mat, whatever you're using. And you can hydrate them with water or shimmer sprays. I think I use the white shimmer spray for this. These are very concentrated forms of ink, so you really only need a tiny little bit. So when this dries, you'll get a nice shimmer. I always find it helpful to have some scrap paper on hand when smooshing, because you can just mop up the leftover inks to add colour to scrap paper, and then you've got something that you can use as a background or for die cutting. So we've got some intense colour on that with a bit of shimmer. So you can smoosh with permanent inks such as archival ink, but you can't really hydrate them with water. They just kind of turn to nothing. Instead, you can add a few drops of isopropyl alcohol, also known as rubbing alcohol, and you can smoosh with these. They will dry very quickly, so you can't really do blending. When using this alcohol, you need to make sure you read the hazard information. It is an irritant. If it gets in your lungs or on your skin, it can cause problems. It's also highly flammable. So definitely read the safety information and use in a well ventilated area. IPA is isopropyl alcohol, not Indian Pale Ale, although you could try it with that if you wanted. But one thing to note with solvents like this, they will soak through the paper and come out the other side. You can clean your smoosher by putting a couple of drops of isopropyl alcohol on it and then giving it a wipe over. You can also smoosh with sticky embossing ink. So this is Ranger embossing ink from the Dabber. It's very thick, it's not runny, but you can still pick it up, cover your smoosher and add it to your card, and then you can drizzle embossing powder over it. And you can heat that with a heat tool and melt it. You can also use glycerin, which is basically embossing ink. It's a little bit more runny, comes out a lot more quickly, or a lot quicker, one or the other. So embossing ink and glycerin can both be used. Anything really that you can make runny enough to pick up with a smoosher, you can smoosh. You can also smoosh with white ink. This is Hero Arts Pigment ink in Unicorn. Add a little bit of water to that. Pick it up with your smoosher, and then you can layer it on top of something darker. And if you want to maintain the lightness of it, you want to dry it quickly, because what will happen is if you're putting it on top of water reactive ink, it will bring the colour out of the paper and into the white ink and tint it. It's quite a nice way of toning down bright colours if that's what you want to do. You can also smoosh with any water-based marker. Just scribble some onto a palette, add water or shimmer spray. So I've done a wet on dry and a wet on wet. So very similar to your dye ink pads. In a similar vein, you can smoosh with alcohol markers. I've scribbled some on my mat. And I'll add some IPA. Pick that up with my smoosher and smoosh it on. You do have to work quite quickly when using alcohol because it evaporates quickly. To me, these smooshes look a bit like flowers, so I think that would be quite a fun way of creating a flowery background. One thing you could try with the alcohol inks and the alcohol markers is smooshing, not on regular cardstock, but smooshing instead on something like Yupo paper or acetate or vellum. You might find some nice effects with that. For this technique, I'm going to use some PVA glue, white glue, school glue, wood glue, Elmer's glue, whatever you call it wherever you are. I'm going to mix that with some water to make it a bit runnier. You could do it straight out of the bottle, but I prefer it a bit runnier. And instead of putting gold embossing powder on this, I'm going to put clear. And instead of sprinkling on embossing powder, I'm going to sprinkle on some of this biodegradable glitter. So once that glue is dried, that glitter should stay put. Right, back to the clear embossing powder. So now my embossing powder has cooled and set, I can do an emboss resist technique. So you can add your clear embossing powder with smooshing with sticky inks. So I've blended over that, and now I can buff the ink off of the clear embossing. And only the card that's exposed has taken up the ink. You can use a bit of moisture on your heat embossed areas to get as much ink off as you can. So that was using glue and water to smoosh. Another glue you can use to smoosh with is a tacky glue. So this is Deco Foil liquid adhesive, and when it dries, it goes tacky. Spectrum Noir liquid glue can be used as well. This is a lot runnier, so you might get more of a smushy effect. And this is Flitter glue from Indigo Blue. That's quite thick. So we'll smoosh on. I'm going to write this down in the corner. Deco Foil glue. This particular one needs to be left to dry for a couple of hours before you can use it. So I'll put that to one side. This one is the Spectrum Noir Versatile adhesive, which is quite runny. So I'll leave that to dry for a little bit. I am cleaning my smoosher in between all of these just with a wet baby wipe. And this next one is Flitter glue. I'm not adding water to any of these glues because I don't want to affect the tackiness. I want them to be maximum tacky once dry. So with the Flitter glue, I'm just going to pop some foil over the top. This is Deco Foil for fabric and paper transfer sheets. Now you can see that the foil has stuck to the smooshing. I've also got some imitation gold leaf here. And press that down with this little sponge. Give it a bit of a more firm burnish to remove the leaf from where there's no glue. I'll put some gilding flakes on the middle part of the panel. I can pounce that down. So if you smoosh with a glue that goes tacky once dry, you can add foil, gilding flakes and gold leaf to your smooshing. Right, my deco foil glue has been sitting for about an hour and a half, I think. So it's nice and dry. And I'm going to use my laminator to add some foil. This is Wow Fab Foil in sepia satin. And I find with the deco foil glues, they work best when heated. So I can put that on like that and I might get a little bit of transfer, but not much. We'll pop it in the carrier sheet. This is just baking parchment really. And I'm going to run it through my laminator on its highest heat setting. I'm going to let this cool a bit before peeling the foil off. That's fine. And there you go, a lovely, smushy, textural, foiled, shimmery background. Right, on to a Nuvo drops now. I've got some Morning Dew clear Nuvo drops here. So I've got clear on there. I'm going to do some smooshing with Copper Penny. So you can use any of the Nuvo drops to do this. Because I put that on quite thinly, it's dried quickly. You can always encourage it along with a hairdryer. It should be able to do a bit of emboss resist. Well, it's not emboss resist, it's drop resist. Or smoosh resist, let's call it smooshed resist. Just dampen that slightly. The Nuvo drops will not absorb the ink colour, but the paper will, so it acts like clear embossing powder. So you can leave it like that, just have the colour showing on whatever background or piece of paper you've put it on, or you can add some ink over the top and do a resist technique. Crystal glaze or glossy accents will do something similar. They're both a bit runnier than Nuvo drops, so they give you a different effect when you smoosh. So that's dry now. Go over that with my ink and buff it off with my microfiber cloth. A bit of water will help lift the ink. It may affect the ink in the surrounding areas. When you add water to ink to smoosh with, what you're really making is a paint. So you can smoosh with paints. These are my Prima metallic accents. So I've just hydrated it with water, put it on my mat, and now I can smoosh with it. So this will give me a lovely shimmery finish. You can, of course, use non-metallic, non-shimmery watercolours to smoosh. And you can do the layering, you can do the blending, you can do the heat embossing, just as you did with the inks. Acrylic paint is smooshable. So on here, I'm going to do acrylic on its own and then acrylic diluted with water. So without water, it's more defined, more saturated, opaque. With water, it's a bit translucent and it's less saturated and more watercolory. But acrylic paint, once it's dried, even if it's mixed with water, is kind of permanent. So you could do things on top of this and the mediums you put on top shouldn't absorb much of the colour. I've got some Nuvo embellishment mousse here, which is a paste, and you can put it through stencils or just smear it onto your projects and it will dry and give you dimension and texture. But you can dilute it and turn it into a paint, and because you can turn it into a paint, you can smoosh with it. So this might look good on a darker background, and the different colours will give you different effects and intensities. Got some black card here, and this should show up on here because it's got metallic in it. So I've tried that, and we've got some lovely pastel-y blue shimmer and shine on this dark cardstock. And this one's now dry, and it's got a very subtle light bluey green sheen on it. This is texture paste, transparent gloss from Ranger. So it comes out of the jar clear. No, it doesn't. It comes out of the jar white, but it will dry clear. And you can colour it with all sorts of mediums. I've got some pigment powder here. I'll just give that a mix to mix the paste with the powder, and I can add water, pick it up with my smoosher and smush it on. So that's mostly dry now, and it's given me quite a different smooshing effect to the other things I've used today, but you've still got that shimmer and shine from the luscious powder that I added. While I've got my pigment powders out, you can smoosh with pigment powders. So I'm going to add water here, and this will just stop my pigment powders blowing away. So I can just go in with my smoosher, mix those in with the water and smoosh them on. The more water you add, the more dilute they'll be. So now I've got another bit of paper here. I'm going to just smoosh with water. And before that dries, I'll just sprinkle over some pigment powder and give it a tilt. And the pigment powder will dissolve into the water. Can see if I can get a few more bits here and there, so you get quite a different effect that way. I'm just going to add some water to this because there's pigment powder all over my glass mat, and I can pick it up with my smoosher and add some more to have an extra piece of paper ready to start a background on. And one last medium that you can smoosh with is watercolour pencils. So I've got Barn Door and Spice Marmalade there. I scraped some onto my glass mat using a knife, and I've just added some water to hydrate them. So basically, if you can add water to something, or if it's runny enough to start with, you can pick it up with a smoosher and smush it down. And there you have it, a whole bunch of mediums that you can smoosh with for different effects, different looks. I hope you found today's video helpful and that it's given you plenty of ideas for things to smoosh with. Hopefully you've got at least one of these things in your stash. If you have gleaned some ideas, do let me know in the comments. And give the video a thumbs up. If you've got any other ideas for things to smoosh, do share those in the comments too. And if you want to see more from me, please subscribe and ring the notification bell, and I'll see you back here very soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.